I never thought 40 years could feel so heavy until that morning, our anniversary, when the kitchen smelled of burnt toast and regret. My hands, wrinkled now like crumpled paper, trembled as I scraped the char off the bread Harold loved so much. He sat at the table, newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee, humming some tune I didn't recognize. 40 years of marriage, and I still didn't know all his songs. That should have been my first clue. But I was too busy planning the day, our day, to notice the weight of what I'd uncovered just the night before. The evening prior, I'd been up late in the attic, rummaging through boxes for an old photo album. We'd always celebrated with a quiet dinner, a bottle of wine, and a flip through memories, sepia-toned pictures of our younger selves, smiling like we'd invented love. But this time I found more than photos. Tucked inside a cigar box Harold kept locked, a box I'd pried open with a hairpin out of idle curiosity, was a stack of letters. Yellowed, brittle, tied with a red ribbon. The handwriting wasn't mine. I didn't sleep that night. I read them all, every word, until the ink blurred with my tears. They were from her, Clara, a name I vaguely recalled from decades ago, a woman who'd worked at the corner store where Harold bought his cigars. The letters spanned years, starting just after our 10th anniversary. Sweet nothings at first, then promises, plans, a life they dreamed of but never lived. The last one, dated 15 years ago, ended with, "I'll wait for you always." I sat there in the dark, the attic creaking around me, and felt 40 years unravel like a spool of thread. But that morning, I didn't confront him. Not yet. I plated the toast, poured his coffee, and smiled when he thanked me. "Big day, Edith," he said, patting my hand. His touch felt foreign now, like a stranger's. I nodded, my mind already spinning a web he couldn't see. Revenge doesn't come with a shout, I decided. It comes with a whisper, slow and deliberate, like the way I'd learned to knit after our second child was born. You loop the yarn, pull it tight, and wait for the pattern to emerge. Harold left for his morning walk after breakfast, his cane tapping the porch steps like a metronome. I watched him go, his gray hat bobbing down the lane, and felt the house settle into a silence that buzzed with possibility. The letters were still upstairs, hidden back in that cigar box, but their words burned behind my eyes. Clara. Her name was a splinter I couldn't pluck out. I needed to know more, needed to see if she was still out there, waiting. I started with the phone book, an old relic we kept by the rotary in the hall. My fingers traced the pages until I found her. Clara Henshaw, 14 Maple Street. The address was less than a mile away. My heart stuttered. Had she been that close all these years? I tore the page out, stuffed it in my apron pocket, and grabbed my gardening gloves. If Harold asked, I'd say I was pruning the roses. He never questioned my excuses, he never had. The walk to Maple Street was brisk, the autumn air sharp against my cheeks. I passed the corner store, long since turned into a laundromat, and remembered Clara's face, round cheeks, a quick laugh. She'd been kind to me once, handed me a free peppermint when I'd forgotten my purse. Kindness didn't erase betrayal, though. Number 14 was a tidy cottage, white paint peeling at the edges, a rocking chair on the porch. No car in the drive. I lingered by the mailbox, pretending to adjust my scarf when the door creaked open. A woman stepped out, older, stooped, her hair a silver cloud. Clara. She carried a watering can, humming softly. My breath caught. She didn't see me, didn't know I was there, plotting. I turned away before she could, my mind racing. She was alive, alone, and close enough to touch. That's when the seed took root. Not just revenge, but something grander, something that would make Harold feel the weight of 40 years in a single moment. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notepad. Harold would be gone another hour. I wrote her name, circled it, then sketched a plan. Not violence, no, that wasn't me. This would be subtler, a slow unraveling he'd never see coming. I thought of our anniversary dinner that night, the wine, the photo album, and then I smiled. The album, that's where it would start. By the time Harold returned, red-cheeked and whistling, I'd already begun. The photo album lay open on the dining table, its pages fanned out like a deck of cards. I'd spent the last hour flipping through it, not for nostalgia, but for strategy. Between snapshots of our kids' birthdays and grainy Polaroids of Harold fishing, I slipped in something new. A single letter from Clara's stack. Not the whole pile, just one, carefully chosen. Dated 1985, it was short but sharp. I saw her today, your Edith. She's so trusting. When will you tell her? I tucked it behind a photo of us at the lake. The adhesive yellowed, but still sticky enough to hold. Harold wouldn't notice unless I made him look, and I would at dinner. The rest of the letters stayed hidden in the attic. This was just the opening move. A pebble dropped in a still pond. I want to see the ripples. Smells good, Harold said, hanging his hat by the door. I'd started a roast, the kind he liked with rosemary and potatoes to keep the day ordinary. He pecked my cheek, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. Big night tonight, eh? 40 years. His grin was wide, crinkling the lines around his eyes. I smiled back, my lips tight, and nodded. Big night, I echoed, stirring the gravy. I've got the album ready. Thought we'd take a walk down memory lane. He chuckled, settling into his armchair with the paper. If he'd known what lane we were really walking, he might have run. The afternoon passed in a blur of small chores, ironing napkins, polishing the good silver. My hands moved, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying Clara's humming, her silver hair glinting in the sun. I wondered if she still thought of him, if she'd kept his letters too. Then, a knock at the door jolted me. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it to find Mrs. Delaney, our nosy neighbor, clutching a pie. Happy anniversary, Edith, she chirped, thrusting it at me. 40 years, my goodness. You too are an inspiration. Her eyes darted past me, hunting for gossip. I thanked her, kept my smile fixed, and shut the door before she could linger. Inspiration. The word tasted bitter. But as I set the pie on the counter, an idea sparked, unplanned, wild. What if Clara came to dinner? What if I invited her, right under Harold's nose? The roast was in the oven, its savory scent filling the house, when I made up my mind. Clara at our table. That was the twist I hadn't seen coming until Mrs. Delaney's pie landed in my hands. It wasn't enough to plan a letter and watch Harold squirm. I wanted him to face her, to see the past collide with the present while I sipped my wine and smiled. But how to get her here without tipping my hand? I slipped into the hall, the phone cold against my ear as I dialed her number from the torn page. My pulse thrummed. One ring, two, then a soft hello. Her voice was thinner now, threaded with age, but unmistakable. I swallowed, steadying myself. Clara? It's Edith. Edith Grayson. Silence stretched on the line, thick as fog. I pressed on. I know it's been years, but Harold and I are celebrating our 40th tonight. A little dinner at home. I thought, well, it'd be nice to have an old friend join us. 6 o'clock if you're free. Clara? It's Edith. Edith Grayson. Silence stretched on the line, thick as fog. I pressed on. I know it's been years, but Harold and I are celebrating our 40th tonight. A little dinner at home. I thought, well, it'd be nice to have an old friend join us. 6 o'clock if you're free. Her breath hitched. Edith, why me? After all this time? She sounded wary, maybe guilty. I kept my tone light, like I was inviting her to a church social. Oh, just reminiscing, you know. You were part of our early days, weren't you? Working at the store. Harold will be tickled to see you. I let the lie hang there, smooth as butter. She hesitated, then agreed. Her all right, I'll come, so quiet I almost missed it. I hung up, my hands shaking, and turned to find Harold watching me from the doorway. Who was that? He asked, newspaper dangling from his fingers. His brow furrowed, but his eyes were clear, too clear. He hadn't heard enough to suspect. Just Mrs. Delaney, dropping off a pie. I lied, brushing past him to check the roast. He grunted, satisfied, and went back to his chair. My heart pounded against my ribs. Clara was coming. The letter was waiting. And Harold, bless him, had no idea the stage I'd set. I laid the table with care. 3 place settings, the good china, a vase of roses from the garden. The album sat at Harold's end, a silent promise. I pictured Clara walking in, her face paling as she saw him, him choking on his potatoes when he saw her. But there was more to do. I needed a trigger, something to force the truth out. That's when I remembered the locket, his gift to me on our 20th, engraved with forever. E. I'd wear it tonight, a quiet taunt. The clock struck 5, and I stood before the bedroom mirror, fastening the locket around my neck. Its gold heart gleamed against my sweater. Forever, etched in a script that once felt like a vow. Now it was a weapon, heavy with irony. I smoothed my hair, gray strands catching the light, and wondered if Clara would recognize the woman I'd become, or if she'd only see the trusting fool from her letters. Downstairs, Harold was fussing with his tie, muttering about the roast smelling better than last year's. "Who's the third plate for?" he called, noticing the table as I descended. I'd kept Clara's visit a secret, letting it simmer like the gravy on the stove. "A surprise guest," I said, breezy as a spring wind. "Someone from the old days. You'll see." He raised an eyebrow but didn't press, too busy pouring himself a splash of whiskey. I watched him sip, his hands steady where mine weren't, and felt a pang. Not love, not anymore, but something close to pity. He thought this was just another anniversary. The doorbell chimed at 6 sharp. I wiped my palms on my apron and opened it to Clara, her silver hair pinned up, a nervous smile tugging her lips. She held a bottle of red wine, a peace offering I didn't want. "Edith," she said, stepping in, "you look well." Her eyes flicked past me, searching, and I knew who she hoped to find. "Harold's in the dining room," I said, taking the wine. "Come on through." She followed, her steps hesitant, and when Harold turned, the glass nearly slipped from his hand. His face went slack, then flushed red as a beet. "Clara," he croaked, like her name was a ghost he'd buried. "Surprise," I said, clapping my hands once, sharp enough to startle them both. "I thought it'd be fun to catch up." Harold stammered something incoherent, but Clara recovered faster, offering a weak, "Good to see you, Harold." The air crackled, thick with secrets I held like cards. We sat, the roast between us, and I poured the wine, hers first, then his, then mine. Harold's eyes darted to me, then Clara, then the table, anywhere but steady. I touched the locket, letting my fingers linger, and saw him notice. "Remember this, Harold?" I asked, voice soft. 20 years. Half our marriage." He nodded, mute, and I smiled wider. The album waited by his elbow unopened. "Not yet." Then Clara spoke, unprompted. "I brought something too," she said, pulling a small envelope from her purse. "A photo. Thought it might fit your album." My stomach lurched. A photo. That wasn't part of my plan. Clara's envelope sat on the table like a live wire, small and unassuming, but I felt its hum. Harold's fork hovered over his plate, potatoes untouched, while I forced a smile and said, "A photo? How thoughtful." My voice was steady, but inside I was scrambling. I'd orchestrated this night, Clara's presence, the letter in the album, the locket's taunt, but this was her move, not mine. She slid the envelope toward Harold, her fingers trembling slightly. "Found it last week, clearing out some things. Thought you'd both like it." Her eyes met his, a flicker of something old passing between them, and I hated how it excluded me. Harold hesitated, then opened it, pulling out a faded snapshot. He stared, his breath catching, and I leaned closer, unable to resist. It was us, Harold and me, young, laughing outside the corner store. I wore a polka dot dress, my hair in a ponytail. He had his arm around me, grinning like a fool. But there, in the background, was Clara leaning against the storefront, her face half turned, watching us. The photo was a knife, cutting through the years. I remembered that day, summer, 1975, a rare afternoon without the kids. We bought ice cream, kissed on the sidewalk. I hadn't known she was there. "Clara took it," Harold said, voice rough, "with that old camera of hers. Remember?" He looked at me, searching, but I didn't nod. I didn't remember her snapping it, didn't recall her being part of that moment. My chest tightened. She'd been there all along, a shadow I'd never seen. "Kept it all these years," Clara murmured, sipping her wine. "A sweet memory." Her tone was too soft, too knowing. Harold cleared his throat, sliding the photo to me, but I didn't touch it. Instead, I reached for the album, flipping it open to the lake picture, and the letter behind it. Speaking of memories, I said, my heart a drumbeat. Look at this one. I nudged the album toward Harold, the letter peeking out just enough. He frowned, tugging it free, and his face drained of color as he read the first line. Edith, what? He started, but I cut him off. Clara's right. Sweet memories are worth keeping. I tapped the locket, watching him unravel. He didn't read aloud, didn't dare, but Clara leaned forward, curious. What's that? She asked, and I saw my chance slipping. She wasn't supposed to take the lead, not yet. Before I could redirect, the doorbell rang again. Harold flinched, Clara froze. I stood, smoothing my apron, and said, must be Mrs. Delaney with more pie. But I knew it wasn't. I hadn't planned this either. The doorbell's echo hung in the room, sharp and uninvited. Harold's hand tightened around the letter, creasing it, while Clara's eyes darted between us, her photo still a silent accusation on the table. I crossed to the door, my steps deliberate, buying time to steady myself. This was a Mrs. Delaney. I knew her knock, quick and impatient. This was something else, someone else, and it frayed the edges of my carefully spun web. I opened the door to a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, late 50s maybe, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face. He wore a tweed coat, hands stuffed in his pockets, and his eyes, hazel, sharp, locked onto mine. Edith Grayson, he asked, voice low. I nodded, wary. I'm Daniel Henshaw, Clara's son. She here. My breath snagged. Clara's son? The letters hadn't mentioned a child, not once. I glanced back at the dining room, where Harold was staring at the letter like it might bite, and Clara was sipping her wine, oblivious. Yes, come in, I said, stepping aside. My mind raced. Henshaw, her name from the phone book. But Harold's child? No, that couldn't be, could it? Daniel brushed past me, his coat carrying the faint scent of tobacco, and stopped short when he saw the table. Ma, he said, and Clara's glass clattered against her plate. She stood, unsteady, her face paling. Daniel, what are you doing here? Tracked you down, he said, his tone clipped. You weren't answering your phone. Been worried. His gaze shifted to Harold, lingering, and I saw it then, the jawline, the way his eyebrows arched. A mirror of Harold, 30 years younger. My knees wobbled, but I gripped the doorframe, anchoring myself. Harold looked up, the letter fluttering to the table. Who's this? He demanded, voice cracking. Clara stammered, my son. He wasn't supposed to, but Daniel cut in. You're Harold, right? He said, stepping closer. She talks about you. A lot. The room tilted. Harold's mouth opened, closed, and I saw the math spinning in his head, the years lining up too neatly. I hadn't planned for this, hadn't known there was a living thread tying Clara to him beyond ink and paper. Sit, Daniel, I said, forcing calm I didn't feel. Join us. It's our anniversary, after all. He hesitated, then took the empty chair, his presence a bomb I hadn't wired. The album stayed open, the letter exposed. Clara's photo glared up at us, and I realized my revenge wasn't mine alone anymore. Daniel's arrival cracked the night open like an egg, spilling chaos I hadn't anticipated. He sat across from Harold, his hazel eyes, too familiar, too piercing, studying the man who might have been more than a name in his mother's stories. I plated him some roast, my hand steady despite the storm inside me, and said, Eat. It's a celebration. My voice was a tightrope, balancing fury and curiosity. Harold pushed the letter aside, its words still unread by the others, and stared at Daniel. Clara's son, huh, he said, each syllable clipped. Didn't know she had one. His tone was casual, but his knuckles whitened around his fork. Clara fidgeted, her napkin twisted in her lap, and I saw her searching for an exit that wasn't there. Born 76, Daniel said, cutting into the meat. Grew up in Ohio mostly. Mom moved us around a lot. He didn't look at Harold as he spoke, but the date hung heavy. 1976, a year after that photo, a year after Clara's letters turned desperate. I did the math again, my stomach twisting. Our second child, Lily, was born that spring. Harold had been home, hadn't he? Clara broke the silence, her voice thin. Daniel, this isn't the time. I didn't expect. She stopped when he held up a hand. It's fine, Ma. I'm here now. He glanced at me, then the locket dangling against my sweater. Nice necklace. Anniversary gift? I nodded, touching it, and saw Harold flinch. Daniel's lips twitched, not a smile, but something knowing. Did he suspect? Did he know? I seized the moment, flipping the album to another page. Let's keep the memories going, I said, my tone bright brittle. Harold, read that letter you found. Out loud. His eyes widened, panic flashing, but I pressed on. It's part of our story, isn't it? Clara leaned forward, confused, and Daniel's fork paused midair. Harold's voice shook as he started. I saw her today, your Edith. She's so trusting, he faltered, the room shrinking around his words. Clara gasped, soft but sharp, and Daniel's head snapped up. What's that mean? He asked low and hard. It's nothing, Harold muttered, shoving the letter down. But I smiled, leaning back. Oh, it's something. Clara wrote it. About me. About you. Harold's face crumpled, and Clara whispered, Edith, no. Then Daniel stood, his chair scraping. I've got a letter too, he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. Found it in Ma's things years ago. Addressed to you, Harold. Never sent. He tossed it onto the table, and my heart stopped. Another letter? This wasn't my script anymore. Daniel's letter landed like a stone in a pond, rippling through the silence. It was creased, edges worn, a single sheet that seemed to pulse with weight. Harold stared at it, his hands frozen on the table, while Clara's face drained to ash. Don't, she whispered. But Daniel ignored her, his eyes locked on Harold. Read it, he said, voice flat. You owe her that much. Owe her. The word stung me, too. I'd been owed something for 40 years, hadn't I? I nodded at Harold, my throat tight. Go on. Let's hear it. My plan was slipping, hijacked by this stranger who might be his son. But I couldn't stop now. Harold unfolded it, his fingers clumsy. The paper trembled as he read aloud, haltingly. Harold, I can't keep this from you anymore. Daniel's yours. I wanted to tell you that night at the store, but you chose her. I've raised him alone, and he's a good boy. But he deserves to know his father. If you ever leave her, we're here. The date at the bottom, August 1980, pierced me. Lily was 4. I was pregnant with Tom. Harold had been working late those months. The room spun. Clara covered her face, sobbing softly, and Daniel sat back, arms crossed, watching Harold like a hawk. You didn't know, he said, not a question. Harold shook his head, mute, then looked at me, eyes pleading. Edith, I swear. Don't, I snapped, my voice a whip. 40 years, Harold. 40. And you had a son. I touched the locket. It's forever a mockery now. Clara's photo glared from the table, her shadow in our happiness. I'd brought her here to unravel him. But this was a thread I hadn't pulled. Daniel spoke again, softer. I didn't come to ruin your night. Just wanted answers. Ma's sick, cancer. Won't be long. She kept saying your name. Clara's sobs grew louder, and I felt a jolt. Not pity, not yet, but something close. My revenge had been for me, for the letters, but now it was bigger. Messier. Harold pushed his chair back, standing unsteadily. I need air, he muttered, stumbling toward the porch. Clara reached for him, then stopped, her hand falling. I stayed seated, the album open, the first letter still there, a relic of my plan. I'd won, hadn't I? He was broken, exposed. But why did it taste like ash? Then Daniel turned to me. There's more, he said, pulling a small box from his coat. She wanted you to have this, Edith. Not him. My hand shook as I took it. The lid creaked open, revealing a ring, my mother's, lost decades ago. How? The ring glinted in the box, a silver band with a tiny sapphire. My mother's, stolen from my jewelry box in 1978. I'd mourned it, blamed myself for leaving the window open. Now it sat in my palm, a ghost from the past, delivered by Daniel's steady hand. How? I whispered, my voice barely breaking the air. Clara's sobs quieted, and Harold paused at the porch door, turning back, his face a mask of dread. Daniel sat, elbows on the table. Ma told me last month, when she got the diagnosis, said she took it. A keepsake. She called it something of yours to hold onto, since she couldn't have him. He nodded at Harold, who flinched. Found it in her drawer after she confessed. She wanted you to know, Edith. Before the end, Clara's voice trembled. I'm sorry, Edith. I loved him. I took it that summer, after Daniel. I was angry. You had everything. Her eyes were red, pleading, but I felt no warmth. She'd stolen more than a ring. 40 years of trust, a life I'd built on sand. I closed the box, the snap loud in the stillness. Harold stepped closer, hands up like he could fix this. Edith, I didn't know about the boy. I swear it was just talk with her, I held up a hand, silencing him. The locket burned against my chest, the album's letters a testament to his lies. I'd planned this night to break him, to watch him unravel with Clara here. But the ring, it was fate's twist, not mine. Then it hit me. The real revenge. I stood, smoothing my sweater, and faced them all. Harold, Clara, Daniel, this fractured family I'd never wanted. Daniel, I said, stay. This is your father's house too, isn't it? Clara, you're welcome until you're not. Her eyes widened, Harold's mouth dropped, but I kept going. Harold, I'm leaving. Not tonight, tomorrow. The house is yours. And theirs. I turned to the album, tore out the lake photo, and handed it to Daniel. Keep it. Your history's in there too. Then I walked upstairs, past the attic where it all began, and packed a bag. The ring went with me. My mother's, mine again. By morning, I was gone, driving to Lily's in the next state, the locket left on the kitchen table. Harold called for weeks, then stopped. Claire passed in spring. Daniel stayed, they say, fixing up the house. I didn't look back. Revenge wasn't the dinner, the letters, or even Clara's tears. It was giving them each other, a family I'd never join. The ring sparkled on my finger as I drove away. Free at last.